Welcome, everyone. Welcome, especially Axel Honneth. We are honored, honestly honored, and happy to have you here on the occasion of your 75th birthday. And of course, we all warmly congratulate. I thought maybe someone is going to sing, but we're not going to sing. It's not yet actually really his birthday. Before I welcome Axel in more detail, I would like to say briefly something about the political situation in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, I have to do this again and again in the SPY 25 discussions, which I have chaired since the Dutch elections on November the 22nd of last year, which I have chaired, which I didn't seem to have to do, which wasn't necessary before that in the previous years. Due, of course, to how much the political situation in our own country has changed. Since 2 days, we have a radical right-wing government here in the Netherlands, or at least a government with the participation of an extreme right-wing party, with a clear right-wing majority in parliament. We all know the political positions of Geert Wilders and his colleagues. We know the extreme right rhetoric that he uses. We also know the fears that many people have, among them our international students. And when we look at France and Europe, we don't get any happier. For feminists like me, or like us, for fighters against racism, for fighters for queer rights, for the equal value of freedom for everyone, this right-wing government is a nightmare. And it is even more a nightmare for everyone who will be targeted by their politics, like asylum seekers, Muslims in the Netherlands, foreigners who don't look Dutch, queer people. So let's not forget where we are when we see and understand ourselves as critical theorists and when we practice critical theory here in Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands, which has a radical right-wing government. Before I now turn to the introduction of Axel Honneth, let me start by thanking my colleagues from the Deutschland Institute who co-organized this event together with the Department of Philosophy, and I welcome especially Petra Schulze-Göcking, who sits there, and Tom Nijhuis, who isn't there, so I don't especially welcome him. Axel Honneth is without a doubt the best-known representative of this generation of the Frankfurt School, the third after Adorno and Habermas, and one of the best-known German philosophers internationally. Of the many honorable and wonderful awards that he received for his work, I would like to mention just one, his Spinoza professorship in 1998, which to me, in any case, many of those discussing this today went probably still aware at school, if at all, probably at kindergarten or even, I don't know, younger. But for me, it was a very decisive event and many, many conversations with Axel during that time. I want to briefly sketch how Axel, I think, understands the legacy of critical theory and how he reinterprets the basic principles of critical theory in his work. I'm doing this by means of three very short perspectives. Firstly, the theoretical approach to the classic themes of critical theory. Secondly, his Hegelian claim to a broad and comprehensive theory of society. And thirdly, his courage to change or transform critical theory where he deems it necessary. Honneth takes up the classic and often ignored topics of critical theory, for instance, in his book Reification, given as the Tanner Lectures in Berkeley in 2005 under the title Reification, a Recognition Theoretical View, in which he analyzes the different dimensions of reification as different dimensions of failed recognition under changed historical conditions. This theme can also be seen in the contributions published under the title Pathologies of Reason, or those published under the title The Fragmented World of the Social, in German much more beautiful, Die zerrissene Welt des Sozialen. which both explore the traditions of early critical theory under the perspective of their meaning for understanding the contemporary social world and the changed circumstances of late modern society. But secondly, Axel Honneth has always defended a broad and comprehensive claim in his critical theoretical work. Already with the first and famous reinterpretation of Hegel's theory of recognition, which he published under the title Struggle for Recognition, he defended an ambitious and extended theoretical framework, an almost Hegelian claim at a comprehensive social theory. This became even more substantial with his work on the right to freedom, and 2 years ago with a new democratic theory of work, or labor, published under the title The Working Sovereign, Labor and Democratic Citizenship. To this claim of a comprehensive Gesellschaftstheorie, one can also add his extraordinarily well-read and fascinating history of recognition, published with the subtitle A European History of Ideas, demonstrating how the concept of recognition changed over the centuries and how it took on different shapes in different European traditions. Let me point out a third, the last perspective on Honneth's theory: the courage to seek new ways in social theory if social and political developments demand it, and to never to be afraid to embrace theoretical developments if they help him to understand and criticize the late modern society. This can be seen already in his dissertation, The Critique of Power, which criticizes Adorno and Foucault, when in critical theory people were not yet discussing Foucault at all. It can be seen again in his book on the idea of socialism, with which he won the Ernst Bloch Prize, another quite good award, next to the Spinoza Fellowship, and which demonstrates that Axel connects to John Dewey's pragmatic democratic philosophy, thereby going beyond the confines of earlier critical theory in his attempts to construct a more extensive and democratic idea of social freedom. This way of defending socialism turned out to be rather uncomfortable for critical theorists, at least for some. However, this courage to embrace new theoretical developments becomes particularly clear in an essay that Axel wrote last year, I think it was last year, on the 100th anniversary of the Frankfurt School. He starts by stating a certain theoretical helplessness. That's a quote which I find a really sort of very powerful expression, as he calls it, in the face of the radical social and economic changes, or better, transformations in society over the last decades. And he goes on to argue that critical theory should use different, for instance, also analytically informed philosophical approaches, including empirical theories, in a radically new way. Let me quote: "In solving this difficult task of understanding and critiquing the society, we would be much better off," Honneth writes, "if we stopped constantly asking ourselves whether we still agree with the old father figures and instead embraced all the theoretical proposals and ideas that surround us today, and try to critically decode our social world, be it studies on epistemic injustices, on social ontology, and on how ideologies are maintained not by conscious thought but by routinized practices." And Axel adds, "We should follow classical critical theory in its spirit, but certainly no longer by its letter." This attitude has earned him quite some criticism, but it's precisely this attitude of courage and integrity, and at the same time perfect awareness of the critical theory tradition having shaped him, that turns out to be philosophically so enormously fruitful, and which is also especially the attitude that so many of us admire. Thank you very much, Axel, and the floor is yours.
First, you have to adjust to this place here. Yeah, welcome. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. I'm extremely grateful to Beate, Daniel, Julia, Titus, and Martin Saar, who will join us tomorrow, for having organized this wonderful conference at the occasion of my not yet 75th birthday. In 2 weeks, I'm getting 75. I'm now a little bit in attention because I would like to at least say 2 personal things, but my lecture is 1 hour long, so I keep the one personal statement very short, and it's about this semicolon, which was mentioned by Daniel, who is sitting there. He mentioned in his introduction to the conference that I have a certain preference for the semicolon, which is true, and I was shocked when I heard the number of semicolons I'm using in the struggle for recognition, which 600, more than 600 semicolons. He gave a very, very philosophical interpretation of it, but the truth is very simple. I'm extremely afraid of separation. And my parents already claimed that I'm awful with separation. When I saw 2 stones separated on the ground, I always wanted to put them together. That's my relation to sentences. I don't like to separate sentences. So it has an easy psychoanalytic interpretation. And it's not far away from a certain Hegelian spirit. I'm very grateful for the wonderful introduction by Beate. I'm glad to hear that I have a certain courage. I'm not sure about it, but at least you try your best. And the same is true for the lecture I will give today, because it's the first time I'm really dealing with something I never dealt with before, namely postcolonialism. When people talk about postcolonialism today, the one word refers at least to 2 different currents of theory at once. The term comes closest to its literal meaning when applied to that generation of political intellectuals who, after the liberation of their home countries from colonialism, began to examine the consequences that colonial rule had left on their own consciousness and that of their compatriots. Here, with thinkers such as Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and Leopold Sédar Senghor, the post in the concept of postcolonialism still quite literally had the temporal meaning of an after, out of whose immediate experience the wounds that the colonialism that had just ended had inflicted on its victims were to be exposed. However, the term loses this meaning of a conscious repulsion from the past when it is used today to refer to the efforts of a new generation of postcolonial thinkers. Their intention is no longer to come to terms with the horrors of colonialism, which was thought to have just been overcome, but to bring to consciousness the fact that it is still oppressively present, even in an age that presents itself as postcolonial. It is therefore no longer the past that is at stake in today's postcolonialism, but our present itself. The temporal reference has changed over the decades. The past tense has now become the present tense of colonialism. With this change of temporal reference, however, the addressees of postcolonialism has also changed accordingly. It is no longer primarily the victims of colonialism to whom the appeal for a change of consciousness and attitude is addressed, but those who continue to benefit from it and who must see themselves as the heirs of Europe's cultural legacy. It is we, people of the West, and not the descendants of the abused and exploited people whom recent postcolonialism seeks to urge to revise their beliefs and intentions. Let me make one remark. When I'm using the term West in the following, I'm referring to the global political alliance that believes it can invoke Europe's cultural heritage today. The term West is extremely difficult, and I recommend an article by my colleague Jürgen Osterhammer, who is going through the different meanings of the West. I'm using it very loosely, but when I'm using us or the West, I'm referring to this political alliance, United States included, the alliance that believes that it can uphold the cultural heritage of Europe. In this case, however, a mere change of consciousness and attitude is not enough. It is true that Western liberal societies must begin by recognizing that their own colonial crimes have by no means been compensated with the decolonization of the previously oppressed peoples. It is evident almost daily from the continuing streams of refugees, the global disparities in prosperity, the regional inequalities in the effects of the blooming climate catastrophe, and the continuing racism, that the end of colonialism under constitutional law has in no way meant its actual end. The realization of these causal connections, however, remains inconsequential as long as it does not turn into a willingness to turn the tide and actually put an end to the never-ending effects of the former colonialism. The task that the Western countries are thus facing are so numerous that it is difficult to gain an overview of them. Here, too, it may be helpful to distinguish between the various challenges according to their temporal references and how they relate to the past, the present, and the future. Clearly pointing in the direction of the historical past is the need to account in retrospect for the intellectual historical process which within the Western European states has contributed to the fact that over the centuries their own colonialism could either be concealed, glossed over, or even justified. The political philosophical tradition on which our cultural self-understanding is still based itself bears a considerable share of the blame for the denial of colonial crimes, so that this tradition needs a resolute reinterpretation, a substantial expansion, or a complete overturning. In the immediate present, on the other hand, there is the difficult task of obtaining as accurate a picture as possible of all the benefits and advantages that the states of the West have derived and continue to derive from the former plundering of the regions they colonized around the world. In doing so, not only economic and social gains must be included in the calculation, but also epistemic and cultural supremacies that have cumulatively resulted for Europe from the fact that the cognitive and moral resources of the peoples conquered by criminal means were devalued from the outset and henceforth regarded as completely fallacious. A third task, which the Western states have to solve today, rather points to the future and consists in the search for an answer to the question under reference to which moral principles, and thus in the form of which compensations, one would have to pay one's own debt in the future for the effects of colonialism, which continue until today. Here, one encounters problems that lead back to the first task because it is more than unclear whether the moral universalism produced by the European tradition can still be a suitable foundation for fathoming the reparation obligations arising from the past. As this list makes clear, the first steps towards the accomplishment of the three tasks named can almost always only be tackled if each time a few steps back into the European past have been taken first. We can only know how to tell our own intellectual educational history more truthfully in the future if we have first learned what has been misrepresented by it so far. The extent of the illegitimate spoils that the past colonization of whole peoples has brought us up to the present can only be adequately assessed if it has first been fully illuminated what future possibilities of social and cultural development those peoples had been deprived of at that time through plundering, enslavement, and degradation. And we can only agree on the appropriate ways of moral reparation if it has been examined in advance while the moral universalism of our ancestors not only did not prohibit them from committing colonial crimes, but even occasionally supported and fueled them in doing so. Not unlike in the framework of psychoanalysis, in the context of coming to terms with our colonial entanglements, a breakthrough to a liberating detachment from the past is only possible if it is preceded by a process of working through one's own formative history. And as in the case of a successfully completed therapy, this failed formative history, in all its aberrancies and distortions, must ultimately be able to be recounted by the affected persons themselves, not by their analysts, which means it has to be recounted by us. To what a radical questioning of our previous thinking and acting such a therapeutic task gives rise, I will demonstrate at two junctions of the previously named fields of challenges. Firstly, where the recollection of our cultural heritage forces us to radically transform our institutional self-image. And secondly, where the reflection on the settlement of our past debt forces us to revise our moral universalism. At both examples, it will become apparent that the inevitable corrections to our self-understanding would at the same time require changes in our institutional practices. I begin with the question of what revisions we would have to make in the future to our own intellectual self-understanding in order to prevent our continuing to be able to deceive ourselves in the deceptive glow of its achievements about the true extent of Europe's colonial atrocities. So the first step, I have two steps, this is the first. The first step towards such a revision must surely be to examine ruthlessly, first of all, the extent to which the intellectual sources of our own tradition, either in their conceptualization or in their basic assumptions, have made the fact of European colonialism disappear or even openly justifiable. To this end, substantial preliminary work has already been done, both on the part of recent postcolonialism and on the part of the Western historians of ideas. Summarizing their preliminary results, one arrives at an extremely sobering picture. Already in the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes, the founding text of the modern tradition of political thought in Europe, the subjugation of the indigenous peoples of North America was tacitly legitimized by describing them as being in a state of nature contrary to Hobbes' own assertion of abstinence from all historical speculation. This opened up an intellectual history, what was then to become standard in political philosophical thought. One pretended to be able to deduce the conditions of a just state order with the help of the thought experiment of a generally agreeable social contract, but more or less explicitly excluded from its scope those who did not seem to fulfill the previously established minimum requirements for participation in the conclusion of the contract as savage or barbarian peoples. A conceptual maneuver that became the central topic of Charles Mill's book on the racial contract. In John Locke, who according to the conventional canon is considered to have overcome Hobbesian authoritarianism, this particularism of the contract theory was reflected in the fact that he almost imperceptibly added to his famous definition of private property that land that had not been further cultivated should be open for possession to those who wanted to cultivate and raise livestock on it, that is, to invest labor. As if through the back door, he had thus given legal carte blanche to those English settlers who at this time were preparing to forcibly conquer the territories of the indigenous people of North America. Hardly any of the contract theories that were to build on Locke's two treatises on government were entirely free of such willing or unwilling gimmicks of justifying colonial land seizure and subjugation. In one way or another, they all contained hidden assumptions that made it seem morally or legally legitimate to use despotic force and impose labor where people lived who apparently did not meet the criteria of rational accountability. Until the time of Kant, however, these political doctrines still operated largely without the additional assertion that human history had objectively followed a direction in its development that had placed Europe at the head of all civilizational achievements. The racism found in the works of Hobbes, Locke, or Kant was therefore still more an expression of conventional prejudices and dull resentments than the result of seemingly scientific research. The turn toward apparently objectively based Eurocentrism began only with the emergence of classical social theories, which no longer sought normative principles for legitimate rule, but aimed at uncovering the developmental laws of social development. Only now, prepared by the theories of progress of the Enlightenment and underpinned by Hegel's philosophy of history, did the idea gradually emerge that history consisted of a succession of historical stages culminating in the modern social order of Western Europe, so that its institutions and mentalities were to be regarded as exemplary for all other regions of the globe. With the emergence of sociology, the scientific successors to this still more or less historical philosophical Eurocentrism became the various theories of modernization, which were introduced at the turn of the 20th century by Emil Durkheim and Max Weber. In these theories, too, the thesis of the rational superiority of Western liberal societies was retained in different versions, but the struggle for scientific integrity was incomparably greater. The hubris vis-à-vis the rest of the world was considerably toned down, and trace elements of racism could only be found hidden in some conceptual constructions or linguistic slips. With the modernization theory of Talcott Parsons, however, these last slacks of Western arrogance and presumption seemed to be finally overcome. In his work, the social structure of the Western states stood quite soberly for a successful synthesis of moral universalism, political democracy, free economy, and successful social administration. All in all, this process of intellectual development had prepared the cultural ground on which Europe, backed by its own social theory, could claim that its moral universalism and its institutional structure gave it a kind of pioneering role in the history of civilizational progress. However, it would be misleading to argue that Europe's cultural self-understanding has been felt solely by this one line of tradition, which has long been regarded as canonical. Rather, over the decades, components have been added to the edifice of thought just sketched, in which more skeptical, darker tones are struck because they have emerged from the theoretical processing of social crises, pathologies, and crimes within Europe. These intellectual counterweights, in which a consciousness of the dialectic in the process of enlightenment flashes up, meanwhile include the conviction, initiated by the workers' movement, that a capitalist market economy without state-guaranteed welfare protections carries with it the constant danger of mass unemployment and social impoverishment. Also added are some set pieces of Freud's psychoanalysis, which, taken together, seem to say that too much drive control coupled with paternal authoritarianism can cause social pathologies that easily threaten to escalate into collective excesses of violence or authority-fixated mass movements. And finally, European self-understanding is now also shaped by the idea that centuries of oppression of women and sexual minorities have constituted a massive injustice that must now be remedied swiftly through legal measures for social equality. Whether we stick to that is a difficult and open question. The conviction that Europe, by virtue of its moral universalism and its institutional achievements in politics, economy, and administration, has a pioneering role in the process of civilization, still forms the substantial core, which has, however, in the meantime been supplemented as a result of a historical learning process by further normative self-expectations, such as those of a basic welfare state, liberal education, and equal treatment of minorities. This may be considered as a mix of astonishingly progressive objectives, but they lack any sign of a return to their own colonial past. Not one of the normative ideas synthesized in Europe's self-image today gives the slightest indication that its own social order and cultural prosperity owes much to a long prehistory of colonialism. This clouding of consciousness, this eradication of all memory of the colonial crimes committed worldwide from Europe in the past, is neither collectively intended nor maliciously set in motion by any authority. Rather, it is the unintended result of the fact that none of the many political philosophical sources from which this self-understanding currently draws provides insight into the atrocities of European colonialism. The formative intellectual process, which is supposed to be able to explain to us where Europe comes from culturally and where it is striving morally, contains at none of its stations indications of the fact that from the very beginning, land grabbing, plundering, and enslavement had been essential attributes of European politics. No matter whether one refers back to Locke, Kant, Hegel, Marx, John Stuart Mill, or Max Weber, in the works of all these authors, the colonialism taking place before their eyes is either completely concealed, marginalized, or even open-heartedly advocated. No adequate understanding of the European past can be gained from this intellectual heritage, even with the greatest effort. How serious this blind spot in our own self-image really is can easily be seen from the fact that we have difficulties to conceptually grasp colonialism and slavery as an immanent part of our own history. Both remain in the collective memory an external event that at worst took place on the periphery of Europe, but never shaped either everyday social life, business activities, or bureaucratic routines in our own countries. Unlike the Holocaust, which we have learned to describe as a catastrophic break with our civilizational achievements, this conceptual device is not available to us in the case of colonialism. It was not a cultural aberration, not a historical relapse behind already institutionally established principles of law, but took place simultaneously with, and yet also in contradiction to, the intellectual formation of those principles. Indeed, one could even go a step further and claim that the colonial conquests, due to the increase in prosperity within Europe that accompanied them, only created the socio-economic conditions for regarding consensual and peaceful coexistence as normative principles for a just social order. The fact that socio-moral improvements on the inside and brutal violence on the outside can form an inseparable, mutually supporting unity can neither be described nor understood in the categories that our intellectual history provides us with. In this respect, the question arises as to what needs to be done so that we can no longer deceive ourselves about Europe's colonial crimes in the recollection of our own formative processes. An answer to this question faces the great difficulty that such massive corrections to the collective perception of one's own historical origins cannot simply be ordered by decree. It would be of little use to suddenly prescribe from on high that Europe's educational process should henceforth be told in a slightly different way, namely supplemented by the hitherto unjustly neglected chapter of colonialism. Because such self-narratives have the character of long-practiced, deep-seated habits and therefore cannot simply be revised by instruction and insight. Like everything that has once become second nature, Europe's historical self-understanding can only be changed from the bottom up and over a long period of time. The great error of those who believe they can make moral amends today by renaming streets or erasing relics of the colonial past is to mistakenly assume that the collective memory of that colonialism already forms an integral part of European historical consciousness. One does not see that such a relearning has only just begun, that the old clouding of consciousness thus continues to exist and thus skips the phases in which a colonial past could be integrated into our own self-image in a catching-up manner. One wants to take a step forward, as it were, without realizing that this would require the first taking a few steps back into the past. The return to the past, which would accordingly be necessary today, would have to begin in schools and universities, where it would become practice to treat the history of the European states only in the same breath as the history of the countries they colonized. This would at least ensure that the illusion would be undermined that the social and economic upswing here actually had little to do with the social, economic, and cultural impoverishment there. But such a spatial delimitation of European history will remain mere waste paper as long as the theoretical resources are not available with which to adequately interpret this coexistence of moral pacification on the inside and the use of violence on the outside. This brings me to the most delicate point of the task of rethinking our intellectual historical process in such a way that it becomes recognizable why colonial practices and racist ideas are products of European intellectual thinking. The difficulty of the task thus outlined is that it requires several innovations, one after the other, each one becoming a bit more tricky. I have already briefly demonstrated the first step in the sequence of necessary corrections here when following the literature already available. It was shown with what theoretical maneuvers and conceptual quibbles colonialism had been repeatedly justified, sometimes in denial, sometimes explicitly welcomed in our own tradition. What we must first learn, therefore, is to read the canonical texts of our own intellectual formative history with entirely new eyes. Their official wording is often not to be trusted because between the lines there are always remarks or reflections that more or less give the word to colonial crime. But this rereading of our own tradition, which has already begun here and there, should not be the end of the matter. Just as we should include in our spatial conception of the expansion of Europe the regions over which colonial rule was exercised, so that, for example, Germany should always be thought of together with Namibia, we should also include in our intellectual tradition all the texts that were written in those only fictitiously distant places in confrontation with colonialism. The second measure that must therefore be taken today is a radical broadening of the canon of European intellectual and cultural history. This must no longer include only texts that reflects Europe's self-understanding in recent centuries, but also studies or literary products that have challenged this self-understanding from within the colonial experience. The classics of our social theoretic tradition should then consequently no longer only include the newly read writings of Locke, Marx, or Weber, but also, and with equal importance, the works of Du Bois, Fanon, or James Baldwin. With regard to colonialism, we would only be making up for what has long begun done with our canon of intellectual history in reaction to feminism. It would be expanded to include treatises and writings by authors whom we have not taken note of only because we did not know them or considered them worthless with regard to our historical self-understanding. Everything I have said so far about necessary corrections to the retrospective view of our intellectual process has something almost self-evident about it. Of course, today, after the postcolonial intervention, we have to screen our classical works for traces of their euphemisms, justifications, or affirmations of colonialism. And of course, today, we have to supplement our canon with works that have analyzed our thoughts and actions from the perspectives of the victims. Both of these, as mentioned, are already underway. Only it will likely be a long time before they are fully reflected in our curricula, in our textbooks, and in our collections of texts. The third challenge, however, that postcolonialism currently poses to the historical consciousness of the former colonial powers is far less self-evident and therefore not so easy to describe. Along with the intellectual historical process of formation, from which Europe's self-understanding continues to draw to this day, a whole ring of basic concepts and pairs of concepts has also emerged, which we have at our disposal quite automatically when describing social and political processes. Thus, since Hobbes, Kant, and Weber, we have been trained to perceive as the epitome of the state its constitutionally regulated monopoly over the means of violence. Since Marx, we have learned to understand labor as contractually negotiated wage labor and to contrast it with capital. We are used to conceive of law as a collection of sanctioned rules of conduct whose generality and neutrality are supposed to ensure that all members of society can enjoy the same freedom. The list of such conceptual landmarks is, of course, much longer, and it is intended here only to illustrate that as a result of a commonly shared formative process, a certain degree of agreement has emerged within the European culture on how we should conceive of the nature and functioning of our central institutions. Anything that does not fit into this conceptual map and therefore deviates from the normative standards that come with it, we describe with the help of residual categories by which we indicate that we consider the corresponding deviations to be something rather remote from us and do not believe we need to map them further. If the state is not a state under the rule of law, it is a state of injustice far from us. If labor does not have the character of free wage labor, it is forced labor laying outside of our institutional system. If the law does not consensually secure the individual freedom of all, it is not really law, but something else. Each time, the use of the residual category indicates that what is thereby meant does not belong to our basic institutional reality. The consequence of this normative way of fabricating our elementary political historical concepts is that we cannot adequately describe as belonging to us or even attribute to ourselves the institutional conditions that the European states once created in the countries they colonized. Never in the past have we felt any conceptual constraint to include in our idea of the constitutional state the brutal violence it exercised there. We never made the conceptual attempt to include in our common idea of labor also the activities that had to be performed there under conditions of slavery or state coercion, without any contractual agreement. Thus, the terms we have learned to use to understand our institutions are not at all capable of illuminating and analyzing the institutional structures that European states produced in the countries they colonized. For the time being, there is an unbridgeable gap between our attempts to also understand these societies today as part of our own history and our ability to adequately describe their institutional structures. Therefore, we cannot avoid subjugating our traditional political historical concepts to a fundamental revision as soon as possible. What has hitherto been being a mere residual category, must no longer remain such, but should be included as a further facet of the make-up of our institutions in their basic conceptual definition. The rule of law must include colonial rule of law with corresponding powers of violence. Labor must also be able to conceived as an important activity with different means of enforcement, as an imposed activity with different means of enforcement in each case. In the context of postcolonialism, this too only retraces something that has long been underway in reaction to feminism with reference to our social theoretical vocabulary. Just as concepts such as work or family have meanwhile been semantically enriched, here by components that had hitherto remained unnamed at the respective spheres, so these and similar key concepts must in the future also be expanded by such elements that reflect the institutional realities created in Europe's colonies by the violence exerting power of its states. Approaches to such a decentering of our political historical key concepts already exist, only they must probably be tackled with even greater energy today. I come to my second point. The idea that there is currently a need for decisive decentering of the conceptual framework of our social theory brings me to the second point of intersection, which I wanted to exemplify the true scope of the challenges facing the West today with the new postcolonialism. A major task of the future, I had said at the very outset, will be to bring about the broadest possible agreement on the moral principles in the name of which European countries should be obliged to make retrospective amends for their colonial crimes in the global South. Part of the difficulty inherent in this task arises at the outset from the fact that the extent of the damage and devastation produced by colonialism is unlikely to be adequately ascertained, let alone quantified. A vague idea of how nearly impossible such calculations actually are can already be gained by realizing that the damage inflicted would have to include the denial of developmental opportunities that presumably would have been open to the colonial countries but for their plunder and degradation at that time. Even before such questions can be meaningfully posed and debated, however, there would have to be agreement in advance as to why Western states should have any moral obligation at all to make retrospective reparations for the crimes inflicted by their historical predecessors. And it is at this point that one of the greatest difficulties confronting us today by recent postcolonialism reveals itself as if under a burning glass. The standard formula currently used to justify such duties of a reparation the descendants of the perpetrators owe to the descendants of those who were injured at the time is that of restorative justice. As the term itself suggests, the obligations stemming from the past are justified by the fact that they are supposed to restore a social relationship that has been completely broken by the former crimes. Of course, much depends on how the social relationship is defined more precisely, which is to be either restored or first established by the compensation to be made according to duty. The more demanding the social relationships are, which one would like to see brought about by the practice of such restorative justice, the more extensive the reparations are likely to be, which have to be fulfilled retroactively. There is also a standard formula today for the type of social relationship that is to be restored or first established, which is that it must be a relationship of equality among democratic citizens. According to this widespread view, the social relationship shattered by colonialism is only fully restored when the descendants of the peoples once colonized can, in view of the compensation paid or made to them, come to the justified conviction that from now on they are included in the democratic practices of public will formation on an equal footing. What is easily overlooked, however, is that this notion of the intactness of social relations is formulated from the perspective of Western societies. For us who grew up in a liberal democratic culture, it may sound perfectly convincing that a successful form of social integration exists when every member of society has equal opportunities for democratic participation. But of course it would be premature, if not presumptuous, to impute exactly the same normative view to those who have so far been excluded from this culture because of the long-lasting consequences of colonialism. And indeed, some proponents of postcolonialism have come to believe that our liberal democratic principles reflect an anthropocentrism that is purely European in origin. Only here, in Western thought, they argue, is the human being so much at the center of the whole cosmos that all questions about an appropriate social order revolve exclusively around human well-being and salvation. In this respect, from the point of view of this wing of postcolonialism, the democratic interpretation of the imperative of restorative justice is doomed to failure from the outset. For, intentionally or not, it would only perpetuate the epistemic injustice that colonialism produced by forcibly suppressing or marginalizing the completely different, less anthropocentric worldview of the conquered peoples. It is precisely at this point that the question of an appropriate revision of our cultural self-understanding touches most closely with the question of the moral justification for Western duties of reparation. Must the corrections we should make to our own tradition of thought today go so far as to drop, along with its inherent anthropocentrism, I think it's wrong, or it's written here, anthropocentrism, our conventional notions of justice revolving around the respect for human person. So far, I have always led the revisions we should make to our cultural self-understanding in the face of the postcolonial challenge and at the threshold beyond which its anthropocentric premises would themselves have to be thrown into the balance. Certainly, through a postcolonial rereading of our classics, we learn that they have concealed or justified state crimes. By opening our canon to anti-colonial writings, we make sure that we can no longer delude ourselves about the violent features of our culture and society. And by decentering our vocabulary of social theory, we bring ourselves to understand the institutional realities in the former colonial countries as facets of our own state and social order. But none of these revisions touched the anthropocentrism that ultimately underlies even our democratic ideals, because they make a successful good social order dependent solely on the nature of interpersonal relationships, not on the relationship to the natural environment. So, do we today also have to question this ontological pedestal of our cultural self-understanding if we seriously want to attempt to make up for the crimes of our ancestors? The call to reconsider our own ontological premises does not only come from the postcolonial side. Also within Europe and the USA, the voices of those who try to dethrone the prevailing anthropocentrism under the keyword of a new materialism are increasing at present, by wanting to grant all material entities the same ontological status of activism, effectiveness, and formative power as only human persons have had so far. The intentions of these Western currents are, of course, very different from those of postcolonialism. Here, postcolonialism, moral arguments are used to demand that the colonial injustice of suppressing non-European worldviews be subsequently redressed by giving a higher priority to a reconciliatory, resonant relationship with nature than is the case in European anthropocentrism. There, on the other hand, and within certain versions of the new materialism, it is lamented with reference to some recent developments in the social natural sciences that in the tradition of social theory, societal orders are thought exclusively as the result of human endeavors, and thus the participation of matter that is active by itself is completely denied. In both cases, however, something very different is then obviously meant by anthropocentrism. In the case of postcolonialism, this worldview is criticized not because it is designed from the perspective of beings capable of intelligence and reflection, but because this perspective chosen by these beings is too narrow or too one-sided. Anthropocentrism is here not the term for an ontological, but for a normative error. This consists in the fact that we humans take ourselves too important in the perspective under which we open up the world and make the value of all components of the reality surrounding us solely dependent on our own interests. This does not call into question the intellectual perspectivity inherent in rational beings, but only their orientation exclusively to human need and benefit. What is wrong is the point of view from which we have made the natural environment available to us instrumentally, but not that we want to open it up at all along the lines of rationally weighable or negotiable principles. Some versions of the new materialism, on the other hand, see in Western anthropocentrism not a normative but an ontological error. What is criticized is not the point of view that the point of view is wrongly chosen, under which the world is cognitively disclosed by us humans, but that only one direction of influence and observability is presupposed at all. In the same way in which humans can influence things, things should also be qualified as being able to influence humans, so that the ontological difference between both entities becomes invalid. From this point of view, anthropocentrism would therefore only be completely overcome if we were to abandon the idea that only we humans have the ability to give meaning to the material things of reality. Since things can also not only causally influence our actions, but also shape them and fill them with meaning, we should in the future instead operate with the idea that humans are in a relationship of complex interactions with the material entities in which neither side has a controlling or constitutive primacy. I do not need to further elaborate on the differences between these two forms of a critique of Western anthropocentrism, because it should already be clear that only the first of them shows sufficient agreement with the presuppositions of the European self-understanding to be able to move its adherents to insight and correction. If with the new materialism the deconstruction of the anthropocentric worldview is driven so far that at the end the difference between animate and inanimate entities completely disappears, then it is impossible to be able to make any normative statements at all about any occurrences in the social world. For as soon as human beings as well as things are supposed to form merely causally acting forces which mutually influence each other and in this way produce societal orders, there is no longer the reflexive instance from which these orders could be normatively judged with respect to their normative desirability or appropriateness. This is not to say that one does not do well to thwart the idealistic exuberance of anthropocentrism by emphasizing the importance of material objects to the moral culture of a society. In every motor vehicle, in every piece of military equipment, or in every form of dwelling, a moral decision from the past has been taken material form that henceforth is taking on a life of its own and acting back with the force of matter on the judgments of those presently living. What Sartre has famously called the counterfinality of all matter produced by us humans. But as illusory as it would be to deny this normative power of things, so inappropriate would it be, conversely, not to always assume the will of one or more rational persons at the end point of such material chains of influence. The criticism of anthropocentrism cannot be pushed so far that finally the difference between causing and volitional doing, between pure happening and intentional acting, becomes completely invalid. The second postcolonial form of criticism of anthropocentrism, however, is far removed from such a de-differentiation. Here the worldview of European modernity is criticized because it takes humans as the sole standard of the value of all natural objects, but not because it considers humans to be the reflexive source of all normative judgments about conditions in the world. If postcolonialism would also take this further step and thus deny that only rational, competent beings can distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, it would deprive itself of the possibility of presenting its own critique of colonialism in moral terms. Today's postcolonialism, however, makes use of this as long as it holds European colonialism morally responsible for having suppressed and eradicated by force the worldviews of indigenous peoples who were striving for balance and exchange with nature. Whoever would like to see these non-European worldviews rehabilitated to some extent today in order to make up for an epistemic injustice of the past cannot therefore subscribe to a critique of anthropocentrism, which also takes away with their reflexive primacy within the natural world the moral responsibility of humans for their actions and omissions. However, we have already briefly seen that even the softer, moderate version of the critique of Western anthropocentrism entails considerable consequences for the European self-understanding. It is true that one may share the language of moral universalism to a certain extent, since one is on the way to understand the colonialism of the past together as an injustice by which generally valid human rights or moral principles were violated. Also in this agreement, it is already reflected that the postcolonial critique of the prevailing anthropocentrism cannot go so far as to pour out with the bathwater of human beings rising above nature also the child of their specific reflexive role and responsibilities in the natural world. But moral universalism, which is the stepchild of such a reduced anthropocentrism, must change its face, indeed its entire frame of reference, considerably if it wants to take into account the postcolonial critique of the Western instrumentalist understanding of nature. In conclusion, I will briefly address the challenges that this poses to the European self-understanding by picking up the thread of my reflections on the idea of restorative justice where I had left it before. This moral principle, as I said, is now usually used to justify the duties of reparation that the West has today towards the descendants of the peoples that it once colonized. According to this principle, the fulfillment of the corresponding reparations is supposed to restore a social relationship that was completely broken by the barbaric treatment of the indigenous population groups in the colonies. Leaving aside whether this relationship was ever so intact that one could speak of a restoration, the crux of justification remains its connection to the Western understanding of society. What is supposed to constitute a successful social relationship is defined exclusively in terms of democratic participation and social inclusion, without it being sufficiently examined whether such terms actually satisfy the ideas of those affected about a successful or intact social relationship. The postcolonial critique of Western anthropocentrism has already informed us that this is not the case. For it is precisely this critique that claims that the West, in its political philosophical thinking, has become so capricious about the conditions of human freedom and the satisfaction of human needs that, in contrast to the worldviews of the peoples it has colonized, it has lost all sense of the concerns and intrinsic values of its natural environment. One does not have to agree with this objection in all details to see that it characterizes a basic trait of the Western understanding of society completely correctly. Only with very few exceptions does one agree here that the moral quality of social orders is measured solely by how the members of society relate to each other, which means whether they are equal to each other, what freedoms they enjoy vis-à-vis others, how much leeway they mutually grant each other for divergent opinions. At no point in this normative register, on the other hand, does it matter what kind of relations the members of society maintain with their natural environment. If this critique is accepted, for which there is now more than one reason, then, of course, the conventional definition of the goal of that restorative justice which the West is supposed to owe to the descendants of the once colonized peoples can no longer be maintained. For an intact relationship with them would not already be established if they were subsequently included in the democratic community as equals among equals as a result of the reparations made, but only if this democratic community were at the same time also to arrive at a different, more careful attitude towards nature. The second condition could be understood as an admission by the former colonial powers that their disparagement and mockery of the worldview of the conquered and deprived ethnic groups that began at that time was not only an epistemic injustice, but also the beginning of a cognitive aberration. In the process of colonization, Western people had come to show only scorn and contempt for such worldviews, which were intended to be balanced with nature, because they were considered to be completely incompatible with the prerequisites of technological progress. The development set in motion by this can certainly no longer be reversed today. Indeed, such a reversal is not even desirable because of the European commitment to a welfare state and thus to basic social provisions for all. Nevertheless, it must be possible to incorporate into the understanding of what is supposed to constitute a successful social relationship the obligation to careful, responsive treatment of nature in such a way that the justified claims of postcolonialism to the retrospective recognition of the then disregarded worldviews of its ancestors are at least to some extent taken into account. This is not an easy task because it cannot be accomplished without corrections to the Western idea of moral universalism. Up to now, this idea was knitted in such a way that it emphasized only the respect for the dignity of all the human beings, whereby progress could be made only by the gradual inclusion of ever new, previously excluded groups of people. Now, however, this moral universalism would have to extend its normative frame of reference and let it extend into nature to a certain extent. How this is to be possible without in turn simply equating natural objects with human persons is the subject of heated debate today. One way out could perhaps be to frame the recognitive relationships between persons with equal rights in such a way that one of its normative conditions also include a mutual obligation to treat nature with care. Such a step would evidently also imply to decentralize our common understanding of individual autonomy. Even further, comprising not only an ability to disclose impulses from one's inner world, but also an ability to be sensitive to what our natural environment is in need of to coexist with us. But the question of what the implications of such an extension of our conception of moral respect would entail, I fortunately do not have to answer here. I only wanted to show with my remarks that before any political answer to the postcolonial challenge, first of all, a careful working through of our colonial past must take place. Without a laborious process of recollection of what mischief and suffering the European states brought upon the countries they colonized at that time, it will not be possible to find means and ways of dealing with the challenges of the present accurately. Thank you very much.
Setzt du dich doch da. So, thank you very much, Axel, and I'm sure there are many, many questions. I think I can talk without, I know it's for the online thing. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. So, thank you very much. I would like to open the floor immediately because I suppose there are many questions and we only have, if I understood it rightly, a quarter of an hour. Okay, hang on, I need my pen. Jörg, yes. Jörg Schaub. Yes, Juliane. Should I use the microphone? Yes. Hello.
Thank you so much, Axel, for the talk. Until the very end, there was no mention of your fundamental term recognition. And so I just wondered how you see the role of recognition in this. So you could think, for instance, about the wrong of colonialism also in recognitional term as an imposition of recognition orders. And then the question is, to some extent, whether you want to hold on to your claim that recognition is an anthropological constant. So whether we describe it as one recognition being violently imposed on another recognition order, or whether you want to sort of be more careful and say, I don't know whether what was there before was a recognition order. Because that probably would also have an impact on how you spell out in recognition theoretical terms what we are meant there. And sort of that relates to your final claim. Did I hear you correct to think that you think it might be conceptually possible to expand the concept of recognition to include relationship to non-human beings? Like when you talk about non-anthropological view. And I would like you to expand on that a little bit. Thank you.
Got the most difficult question already at the beginning. I had hoped I don't have to talk about this.
You wait.
I mean, first, in using the notion epistemic injustice with respect to the colonial practices includes already reference to recognition. Yeah? It means that there was not only a complete misrecognition, or if you want so, there was not only a complete rejection of the other people as possible being included in any kind of reasonable recognition relationship, but there was also a kind of a kind of rejection and devaluation of the epistemic worldview they had. And that is clearly expressible in recognition terms. I mean, I don't see any problem with that. Yeah. So, what I never did before, but what can be done, is to redescribe colonialism as a specific form of non-recognition. And I think one could go in much more details to spell that out. So I don't, and when I heard Christina Leopold today speak about, reframing the idea people have of racist ideologies, and that's a very convincing idea of what is constitutive for a racist ideology, I thought that can be easily reconstructed in recognitional terms. Yeah? The second part of the question, I think, is more difficult. I framed it somewhat differently, but probably I proceed in two steps. First, I think it is possible to extend relationships of recognition of a specific kind towards non-human beings. And I think this is not really new. We only have to observe how people sometimes treat their pets. I mean, there is a kind of one-sided recognition, taking these pets as belonging to the human life world, including them into one's own world, and treating them as if being able to speak. So that is a specific form of recognition. It is one-sided, for sure. It has a certain reciprocity, but the reciprocity is relatively simple, I think. And in that sense, it is not, in the Hegelian terms, a full recognition relationship. But I think that's possible, but that is not what I meant. Yeah? What is true is that, to my knowledge, and there is a lot going on in the studies of the worldviews of indigenous people, yeah? And the literature is growing from day to day. But I think what is safe is to say that they didn't operate with that kind of instrumentalist anthropocentrism that was developed in the Western tradition. I think that it might be possible to describe it as a kind of anthropocentrism, but very differently than the one that belongs to our tradition, namely where these people took themselves as being also responsible for how nature can develop and whether nature can coexist with them. So they took their own responsibility towards nature extremely hard and took it being very important. So what I thought at the end is, how can we translate the need to revise our moral universalism, namely including that one of the central components of any kind of moral universalism has to be a resonant relationship also to nature. And that is out of a simple reason, because any kind of moral universalism that reduces itself only to the relationship among human beings would ignore that these relationships are heavily depending on a non-instrumental relationship towards nature. Yeah, human relationships wouldn't be able, as we know now, wouldn't be able to survive. So any kind of recognition among human beings wouldn't be possible without, at the same time, taking nature as something we not only have to coexist with, but we have to take care of in such a way that it is able to flourish. And this is a precondition for any kind of recognitional relationship. But what I wanted to say was a little bit different. I wanted to ask myself whether if we are on the way to revise our understandings of individual autonomy. And I'm speaking here next to somebody who is really an expert on this, and so I know how dangerous it is to talk. So if we are on the way to decentralize a little bit our own understanding of individual autonomy, and we include in it not as in the former traditions, also a certain capacity to be open to oneself and to be resonant to one's inner voices and inner sentiments, then why not go one step further and include in that understanding also the learning that we have to be more, not only more open to our inner nature, but also to our outer nature. And whether, if that is true, and if that informs our understanding of individual autonomy, then it could change our understanding of mutual recognition, because then what we take as what has to be recognized in the other would then also include, as part of autonomy, this development of certain capacity towards a more resonant relationship to nature. That was the idea.
Yes, Juliana.
Yeah, Axel. First of all, thank you for another impressive demonstration of your incredible gift for synthesizing complicated debates. I admire that. Two questions. One is really small, I guess. It concerns the title, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. And I heard you saying, let's not jump to renaming streets. Let's first take 2 steps back. And the small question is, why cannot be the renaming of a street be the occasion for public working through? So that's the first small question. So that would take the 2 sides of your title together. The second question is a bit larger. I guess it's about the critique of new materialism. Because I thought new materialism, so the ontological correction that is aimed at, if one puts it in very, very general terms, is to grant activity to what counted as mere dead matter, right? And so that also sheds a different light on human history in pointing to the embeddedness of human history in processes and networks of actors that are non-human. And I thought there is a connection, actually, to the normative side that you were ascribing to the postcolonial side, and actually also when you read some of the new materialisms, there are lots of references to indigenous cosmologies. And so I guess I was just not sure about this very harsh desire to get rid of new materialism in the debate.
Actually, you have to be
short, yeah. That's not easy with such questions. I start with the second question. I mean, there are very different versions of new materialism, yeah? And when I was writing and speaking now, I was mainly referring to people like Latour and not to people like Descola. I mean, there are different versions of this new materialism. I know, and I mentioned that, how important it is to realize what I refer to with the notion counterfinality using Sartre, namely that all matter has a much more, let's say, determining force than we probably ever wanted to be true. Yeah, and it determines how we live. Most of the matter is human produced, that we also know. So what we know, meanwhile, and which should not be ignored at all, is that matter we produced develops its own life and its own, I've referred to finalities, which means it works back on us. There is no question about that. I meant, and this still can be reframed in exact the same normative terms I was using with reference to the critique of anthropocentrism as I think it is mainly developed in the post-colonial camp. Now, it all depends how you exactly define anthropocentrism, yeah? And I define it in such a way that it leaves room for defining what is taken at the center differently. Namely, a switch from the center as the instrumental human being to the center as the responsible human being. That is still a kind of anthropocentrism. And I think that certain authors in the tradition is not the right word, in the camp of new materialism wouldn't allow that distinction, I think, because they attack anthropocentrism out of much more radical reasons, namely out of ontological reasons. And I don't buy this ontological critique of anthropocentrism. So what I buy for sure is that we should learn to understand that in different cultures we had very different relationships to nature. Matter was treated differently and has to be treated differently and has to be treated not as instrumentally as before. All that is sure. The question is about how whether we can escape anthropocentrism or not, and I think we can't. So that's answer to the first question is renaming. I think that a too quick renaming is always false. It's not only now false, it was false in the process of German unification, where the West was extremely quick in renaming all streets, yeah, without even letting the others, which means the people from the East, allow to understand why we are doing it, why we didn't want the name Lenin not on any longer. Without explanation, we changed names. There was not the slightest chance for a learning process. Or famous example, which I just read in Jenny Erpenbeck's book, Kairos. The name of the place, Platz der Akademie, was changed overnight in Gendarmenmark. How do you understand that? And why suddenly call it Gendarmenmark? Yeah, Gendarmen is a complete absent word from our everyday language. So I think if you do that, and probably there will be a future where we have to change names, do it with a preparation that allows people to look back in the history of the street. And not do it overnight and not do it simply by explaining why you did it, but allow people over many years, if not decades, to understand why certain street names are wrong or why certain notions they shouldn't use any longer. I think it needs much more going back in the past before doing these steps today.
Okay.
It's too long.
Yes. So the Joseph behind you, the blonde.
Thank you.
Young man behind you.
No.
What's it? Yes, come on, don't be shy. Maybe you? Somebody? It was Joseph. Oh, it was Joseph. Sorry, Joseph, sorry. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Axel, for your presentation and the interesting suggestions. I also would like to stay very briefly with the idea of an extended recognition, extended universalism, because I think that this idea requires a certain epistemic step, and I would suggest to call that step or to describe it with terms like sensibility or imagination, whereas you quickly referred to something like resonance and the as-if status of judgments. So we should put ourselves in a situation as if nature could speak to us. And I would say we do have in our Western tradition a brilliant model of that, an analysis of that as-if status of judgments. And this is, with Hannah Arendt, Kant's third critique. reflexive judgment, aesthetic sensibility is a mode to learn how we put ourselves into the shoes of others, how we extend our imagination, how it feels. That's the point. How it feels to listen to others, and that's the epistemic step. I think I would like to suggest.
Can we take the questions together, because we should stop already? So is that okay with you, Axel? So it's Daniel and Christina. Maybe Christina first.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I think there's much I can agree to, but I wanted to come back to the idea of restorative justice, and I think my question connects nicely with the first question that Juliana asked, because I was a bit surprised because you only spoke about restorative justice in the context of reparations, and I agree that we or the people who have benefited from sort of colonialism and sort of continue to be privileged by it sort of owe something like that to descendants of those who have been sort of subject to colonial rule. But I was really surprised that you sort of dismissed so quickly the renaming of streets, and I think there are other proposals like, I don't know, in general, being aware of one's language and also restitution of artworks, etc., etc. And I was, because you were talking about restoring that sort of social relationship needs to be restored, and I would say that sort of many of the descendants of those who are subject to colonial rule are part of our societies, right? And they feel sort of excluded by these very street names, and sort of they feel that the relationship will not be restored as long as there are sort of racist and colonial sort of street names, for example. And there are other examples. So I was wondering whether that shouldn't also be part of sort of what you envision as sort of restorative justice.
Thank you. Thank you also from me for this talk. I have a very basic question, namely, what exactly do you mean by we? Listening to you, one could almost get the idea that the descendants of the colonizer and the descendants of the colonized are quite homogeneous groups, and both like politically, institutionally, as well as in terms of the normative canon that we have our Marx and Locke and Weber, and they have their Baldwin and Du Bois. And I think, if you look at Amsterdam, the capital of a colonial empire, you see it's a multicultural society, as all post-colonial metropoles are. Doesn't that complicate the whole picture tremendously, both in terms of we're making the canon more reflective, as well as the problem of reparations, right? And for the canon, I think this is actually something that you can learn, or we can learn from post-colonial theory, at least from the subaltern studies groups like Spivak and Chakrabarty and so on, that they are not saying we should simply integrate non-Western theory, but that's not an option anymore, because it is so hybrid. The theories, the normativities are contested but also mixed, and it is no coincidence that the two authors of anti-colonial theory that you mentioned, Fanon and Du Bois, are Hegelians. So they are actually using Western theory. So I think that's not so complicated. It's more complicated. And the same goes for the question of reparations. The question who should pay reparations to whom, I think is really complicated when you think of that the taxpayers of former colonial powers are often racialized communities, are descendants of colonized peoples themselves. Anyway, I would be interested in hearing what you have to say about who is this we, and how does it change the picture if you have a more heterogeneous understanding of this we?
And you give me 1 minute.
I give you 2 minutes. No, I give you 5 minutes.
Is this on? So let me start with Josef's question. There were 3, yeah? Am I right? Yeah. I think I agree to that. I don't know whether I would take Kant, third critique, as the best example, but what I would say is, sure, there are the West has developed its own tradition with ideas of how to understand nature, natural environment differently, namely, and you mentioned sensibility. I think that there are always attempts to overcome the subject-object split, yeah, and to understand nature as if it has its own voice. And I would say the first one to do that with huge philosophical knowledge, and probably more radical than Kant was probably Goethe and some of his followers. Yeah, so Kant, I mean, as you know, Kant did that hypothetically. He thought hypothetically we can think of nature as if, but others developed other epistemic instruments to, let's say, to develop methods that give us more direct information about possible needs of our natural environment. And that, I wouldn't deny at all how important that might be. I think all that doesn't mean to give up the anthropocentric horizon in which we are doing all that, because we think we have to develop all that in order to get more accurate knowledge of what nature is in need of. But it's still that we're taking us as the listening ear. Yeah? It is us who think, and we have to rethink of how to do better. And we can debate then internally whether Hannah Arendt's Kant or whether other resources are more helpful here. I think the Western tradition has some resources for doing that. Christina, I don't know whether I should reduce myself again to the point of renaming. Yeah, I think this lecture was a lecture from our perspective, and it was insisting that it is us who have to learn something. And I was raising the question, how can we learn best? And not we here, the academic circles, but those who will also have to pay for all the redistributions and the retributions we will have to come up with. And so the question is, I think I addressed the question best, again, by reference to the psychoanalytic model I had in the beginning. Yeah, I think we, and the we includes now, I mean, at this stage, mainly those who are still living in countries who are heavily profiting from former colonialism. Those people, including myself, we have to learn why we have to do that. And that means that we have to go back in our past, and we can't go back in our past if we are going too fast. And I think that means we have to give everyone a chance to understand why we are renaming streets. And the question then is, how strong are other people, I mean, racialized people, or black people or whatever, are suffering from the fact that we think we should have this signs of our colonial past longer on our public places, because it needs us more time, us all of us, more time to learn why we will rename it in the future. And I am pretty sure they will heavily understand why we do that. Yeah?
Okay, I think now you should go and answer Daniel's question.
Okay, the we. Yeah.
The we, because you've been using it quite a lot.
Yeah, I said in the beginning, I'm speaking about the Western world, yeah? And I know that the Western world is not a purely white world, and it's not a world purely out of people growing up as European citizens, yeah? And I know that if I speak of the West, I speak of those whose ancestors were still responsible for the colonial crimes. That then brings about a lot of internal difficulties, for example, with taxpayers who are not descendants of the earlier states who did the crimes is very obvious, yeah? And that only means we have to find regulations and rules how to come to do justice to them, who are not really descendants of those colonial states. And I think that is a question of balancing the costs of reparation among different groups. So when I speak of the West, I mean everyone profiting, living in the West from former crimes.
That includes black people in the United States? That includes indigenous people?
No. Black people in the United States are having legitimate claims for reparations, obviously. They were enslaved. They are the first to ask for reparations. And they don't belong to that we I was speaking about. They never were referring to the European tradition to justify slavery. They were, as you know, they were fighting slavery. They don't belong to that we I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about those who are referring to the European tradition in an affirmative way and think that they have to act out of that tradition.
Yes, thank you. I think the conversation has to go on at the reception. Thank you very much, Axel, for this discussion. Thank you.